So if y'all are ready, I'm ready to get started with the Joan of Arc series from Extra History. I believe, given the little bit of the narrator that I caught a second ago when I was pulling up the video, that this is must be a slightly newer one, because I know the like high pitch, more cartoony narrator voice is like the old stuff, and then the new stuff is like this deep voice narrator guy. So that's fun. I checking out the new stuff. It still is similar in spirit, but there is something very different about it. I also like the refined visuals of the newer stuff I've found, so that's fun. So what do I know about Joan of Arc? Earlier today I was talking about it, trying to figure out like, what do I actually know about her? I did a paper on Joan of Arc, and it wasn't even that long ago. It was right before I got into grad school, and I don't remember anything about it. Oh, I rushed that paper out so bad. It's one of those things, like, you're not gonna learn anything if you're not trying to learn something. I think that's how I think of my experience with Joan of Arc. I was not really trying to learn about Joan of Arc, therefore it was all in one ear and out the other. I might be able to bring up some things, but a lot of this is probably going to be new. I know she starts from humble beginnings. She's fighting because she's hearing what she thinks is the voice of God telling her to fight for this particular dude. So she's like, there is kind of the, I guess, she's one of those characters that's turned into this pseudo-feminist icon, but she is known for fighting for a guy. So it's one of those things that's like kind of ironic. Other than that, I don't really know. And there's this conversation about whether or not she was like this great military leader role, or if she was like just being used as sort of a mascot for the people around her who had their own military desires. And she's synonymous with being burnt at the stake. So when you think of somebody being burnt at the stake, I often go back to Joan of Arc. So this first episode is called The Mad King. I believe there's 5. So let's get started.
July 1st,
excuse the bird.
1392. King Charles VI is riding at the head of his army, and the leper has been following them for a half hour. "Turn back, noble king," the leper shouts. "You are betrayed." Those words again and again. As the minutes pass, Charles begins to sweat. Is he in danger? This whole expedition is to punish a man who'd tried to assassinate his best friend. He eyes his courtiers. He feels them watching him, but when he looks, they look away. It is so hot. A page, drowsy from the long ride, drops a lance. It clangs when it hits the ground. "Traitors!" Charles shouts, drawing his blade. He rushes forward, hacking at his retinue. Stunned and unwilling to draw...
Sorry, Neron was wondering if my map had the Southern Ocean. I don't think it does. No. This map is not perfect. It is not a perfect map. It is definitely lacking some stuff. It's a bit hard learning about Joan of Arc without getting into the entire history of England and France. Yeah, I get that. I'm just gonna simply do my best.
Swords on their most Christian king. All the courtiers can do is wrestle him out of the saddle. But by the time they pin him to the ground, 5 men are dead. Charles stops struggling. His eyes roll back in coma. The courtiers exchange looks. The king is in the grip of madness, and soon France will follow him. Before the miracles began, before the siege of Orleans, before the saints appeared to a peasant girl, France was a country cursed by God. And that began with King Charles the Beloved, or as he became known, Charles the Mad. Because that first psychotic episode would not be the last for the French king. At times he was perfectly lucid, able to rule as he used to, but then he would slip, failing to recognize friends and family, not understanding that he was the King of France. instead insisting
He was a paranoiac.
he
Okay.
was St. George. Or wearing thick clothes with iron bands sewn in because he thought he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. And on occasion,
Huh.
he would run wild through the halls of his residence. Court officials had to brick up entrances to keep him inside. With Charles incapacitated and often confined, rule fell to a council of regents overseen by Queen Isabeau. And this wasn't actually the worst time for France. There had been a truce in the 100 Years' War, and the country was at peace. People were thinking about taxes, not armies. Because here's the thing.
That's
While
not bad.
Charles was unable to rule consistently, he wasn't dead. The crown hadn't passed to his sons. It was all about the council. And as councils will do, this one split into factions. Particularly as the older generation of council members died, leaving their seats to their children. Two main groups emerged, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, both led by men of the
okay.
royal bloodline.
Yeah,
The Armagnacs
I've learned
were
about
led
this
by
a
the
little
king's
bit.
younger brother Louis, Duke of Orleans. Powerful, rich, and famous for his voracious pursuit of women.
So he's Louis the First. This is like the Louis line goes for a while. Like I'm not entirely sure. Like I guess you don't necessarily have to be part of the same line, like the same direct line, to be like if he's Louis the First and you're like some distant nephew or something that becomes king, you could, and you're also Louis, you could still be in the line of Louis, right?
He was extremely close to the queen. Suspicious.
Like you don't have to be Louis' son or grandson or great grandson. You could be like kind of an offshoot of that, and you could still be considered like Louis the Third or Louis the Fourth. I don't know exactly how it goes early on. I started paying attention to Louis at Louis the 14th, so there's a lot of Louis I've missed out on.
Close, some said, even whispering that her third son Charles was actually fathered by Louis. Economically, they wanted France to remain the traditional agricultural country that it was. On the other side were the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundians held large parts of northeast France, where they would...
Yeah, it's just about being king. Okay. I know there's like different policies around being king depending on when. I mean, there's different norms around being king, but I wasn't sure if that like extended to the naming or not. Like I don't study royalty very often. There's a handful of kings that I encounter in my studies, so I don't really have to worry about succession too much. There's only like a couple cases that it really matters, and it doesn't really matter in that conversation, I guess. I don't know.
was heavy English influence due to the invasions of the 100 Years' War, and they were tied economically to Britain via the textile trade. So perhaps, not surprisingly, they were interested in developing France along an English model with strong cities and increased emphasis on pasture land and sheep farming. They also supported different popes. Yeah, there were like 3 popes running around at this time. It's a long story we won't get into. But their issues weren't all ideological. Other things that came between them were very
chair!
Rumor had it that Louis had tried to seduce John's wife. But the gist of the whole thing is that a decade into the council's existence, these factions were locked in a struggle to control the throne. Relations between the factions had been curdling for years, when Louis of Orleans, leveraging his close relationship with the queen, started minimizing Burgundian influence on the council, while also buying up land in the Burgundian sphere of influence. This also meant diverting royal gifts from John to himself, until Louis had an annual income 5 times larger than his rival. John the Fearless responded by adopting populist policies, whipping up the commoners and merchants by promising to abolish taxes that, he said, did nothing but pay for the extravagant court life. With tensions escalating, the two sides kidnapped members of the royal family.
I mean, I don't know what his intentions are. I don't know what that meant. Like, abolish taxes that he felt did nothing but benefit the royal family. I don't know if that's meaning like abolish all taxes because taxes in general just benefit the royal family, or if he's saying that I'll abolish these specific taxes. Like, there are ways of raising money without taxes, but that often involves like serious subjugation, maybe imperialist warfare, and the spoils of war being used to pay for the government, but that kind of puts a government in a place where it relies on perpetual war. I'm not sure exactly what he's going for.
Including the Dauphin, the crown prince, back and forth. Finally, they openly threatened violence. Everyone needed to cool down, the court decided. So on November 20th, 1407, the two parties reconciled in a court ceremony. But as they made their vows, a hit squad living in a rented house talked through their plans, sharpened their weapons, and bought masks. 3 days later, a shoemaker's wife looks out her window and saw Louis of Orleans leaving the queen's residence, a song on his lips. She looked away, heard shouts, and looked back. She saw Louis pulled from the saddle, thrown to his knees, surrounded by men with swords and axes. They struck him again and again, beating him like a mattress, until a man in a red hood told them to scatter. The attack was so brutal that they had to scoop bits of Louis into his coffin. His severed hand, which he raised to defend himself, became a symbol of Burgundian savagery. And John the Fearless owned it, arguing that he'd ordered the killing for the good of the crown in order to remove an evil and corrupt tyrant who defiled the queen and plotted to murder the king with necromancy. Charles, reportedly
with necromancy,
pardoned John and called for
I'm sorry, just the use of those words in a serious capacity is hilarious.
Truce. A year later, the factions were embroiled in a civil war. For a decade, the fighting would start and stop, with truces called and broken on an almost annual basis. And this civil conflict reached unheard of levels of viciousness. Soldiers scoured the country, sacking villages and looting everything.
Hold on un segundo. I've got a phone call. There we are. Sorry about that, guys. I had to answer a phone call. I applied for a really important job that I can't afford to miss that call. So if I randomly mute myself and decide, hey, I have somebody else to talk to, that's what it is. Forgive me for such acts.
Even the clothes off of the backs of slaughtered peasants. Paris changed hands multiple times, with poor Queen Isabeau having to hop between factions in order to protect the inheritance of her rapidly diminishing stock of sons. The Dauphins of France seemed to be cursed, with one dying of disease every few years. And then, disaster struck. Seeing his opening, Henry V invaded the divided France in 1415, as can be seen in our History of England series. But his campaign quickly bogged down, and an Armagnac force caught him as he was trying to march to the safety of an English-held city. The Armagnacs had more men, and the English were exhausted, demoralized, and riddled with disease. But there was the mud, and the rain of arrows. The French knights were heavily armored, but their horses were not. And by the time the armored Armagnac forces slogged into the battle line, they were so exhausted they could barely lift their weapons. Men who fell drowned in the sucking earth. The flower of French nobility,
It's
3
brutal.
dukes, 6 counts, and 90 other nobles died in a single day. Many others were captured. But for France, the disaster continued when the Burgundians, seeing an opportunity, broke the fragile truce and made a grab for Paris. Instead of uniting, the factions played the blame game. The Burgundians argued that the Armagnacs had lost a crucial battle, and the Armagnacs claimed they would have won if the Burgundians had bothered to show up. The civil war continued, and the English advanced, with the Burgundians often standing to the side, an English ally in all but name. Soon, there were 2 Frances, with 2 capitals. Every level of society,
Oh, that's
from
fun.
the plowmen in the fields to the academics in Paris, chose sides. And as France split, the royal family did too. Though originally an Armagnac, Queen Isabeau defected to the Burgundians after her former allies imprisoned her. But her surviving son, Charles VII, now Dauphin, despite rumors of illegitimacy, was literally married to the Armagnacs. His stepmother, Yolande of Aragon, was a major string puller in the Armagnac faction. So when Isabeau ceded her powers as regent to John the Fearless, and the two combined forces to drive the Armagnacs out of Paris, they were also driving out her son and heir. He had to flee amid the monumental slaughter of the city's fall.
The crisis of legitimacy. Oh, I'm so excited. Oh, that's where we're going, right? Crisis of legitimacy.
Burgundians held the capital and the king and queen. The Armagnacs held their heir. This could not continue, it was decided. The Dauphin invited John the Fearless to peace talks. The initial approaches in July of 1419 went well, and the two agreed to meet on a bridge that September in order to hash out a final settlement, in order to end the Civil War.
And then the bridge collapsed.
The confrontation was tense. John knelt. The Dauphin rebuffed him. Then something happened. Perhaps John put a hand on his sword as a mark of respect, or perhaps the Dauphin's Armagnac attendants just claimed he did. An Armagnac man buried an axe in John's face. The attendants beat him like a mattress and cut off his hand as John's assassins had done to their own lord a decade before.
Okay, no, they definitely betrayed him. Like, I don't know anything about these people, but those guys who say, like, he put his hand on his sword, they're full of it. They're totally full of it. I don't believe them at all. Like I said, I have no idea what's going on right now and no knowledge of this. This is just my gut. I don't believe a damn thing they say. They were gonna attack him from the beginning.
The Dauphin claimed that it was not planned, but he had motive, had arranged the means, and had the opportunity. Most of France, including his own parents, believed...
Like, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I don't, not even I am willing to pretend that wasn't the perfect murder.
That their heir to the throne had lured a duke into peace negotiations and murdered him. So the new Duke of Burgundy made his flirtations with the English official and entered an alliance with King Henry. And the French royal family did too. After all, their designated heir was a murderer. No other issue could inherit the throne. But Henry had a claim. So a year after John's slaying, the King and Queen of France disinherited their son, married the English king to their daughter, and officially declared Henry and his children the inheritors of the French crown. France was more split than ever, its throne given over to a foreign occupier. Every year the English and their allies pushed further south, and in a small village, a girl named Joan began to speak with saints.
I love when they do. I like when they lay it out like this. The first episode didn't even really have any real inclusion of Joan. It just gave us as much context as it could in a single episode, and I like that as a general rule to their layout. I enjoy that they, like, the first episode is just building the world that we're going to be in. There are going to be some religious elements here, something that I personally will likely not buy into. If you're of the belief that Joan literally spoke to saints, I apologize if I upset you with my doubts, but I'm not like, you can talk to God, but if God talks back, like, you might want to question, like, if you're doing all right. You know, like, I was under the impression that it's supposed to be like a one-way thing, and then you see it, like, well, it's talking to saints, not necessarily talking to God directly. So, I don't know. It's all very confusing to me.
February 22nd, 1431, Rouen Castle. A young woman stands amid inquisitors and theologians. She is an illiterate peasant, yet 3 notaries stand ready to scribble her every word. This is a trial where she is both defendant and the only witness, and they are determined to rule her a heretic. They asked
Oh,
her
that's fun.
about the first time she heard the voices. It was when she was 13, she said, in her father's garden. I heard the voices on the right-hand side, toward the church, and rarely do I hear it without a brightness. The voice was sent by God, and I knew it was the voice of an angel. Was it an angel, they ask, or a demon?
Ooh, that's one of those things when it comes to like things that are unfalsifiable. It could be whatever you want it to have been, really. I could make an argument that it was a demon. It would be equally convincing. Because she is literally the only witness in her own trial. They've just got to be like, yeah, this seems right. Or this doesn't seem right.
To the villagers of Domremy.
There's no actual way of verifying this.
There was little hint that Joan would go on to do great things. She came from a farming family, humble, but with a leadership role in the village, and spent her youth spinning cloth and helping in the fields. Most expected her to live, marry, and die in Domremy, just like so many generations of girls had done before her. Though there were a few odd things about her. First off, she was a particularly devout child, one so eager to attend mass and take local pilgrimages that other children teased her for it. And on occasion, she spent excessive time at confession.
That is one thing about Joan of Arc from the little bit that I do know. I don't think she's necessarily, like, even though I don't believe she actually talked to saints, I don't necessarily think that she's lying. I think that there might be an element of her that may be unwell. Because I genuinely don't think it doesn't seem as if it's in her character to necessarily lie about that. I think to her, that's what she truly believes happened. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wouldn't accuse her of actually like lying about that, because like it seems as if she was a genuine Kool-Aid drinker when it came to her religiosity. She believed it to the end of the earth. And if she genuinely believed it happened, maybe it's something going on in her head. Maybe she was mistaken in some capacity, or this is just her way of interpreting her own religious feelings and how it manifests. And I don't know. It's weird.
Little town of Domremy.
Her house still exists? Wow.
With its own identity. In fact, Joan didn't even consider
cool.
herself as living in France. The area where she lived was officially neutral in the ongoing civil war, but most people leaned Armagnac and considered the Dauphin the legitimate king, which was unfortunate, since it was also surrounded by Burgundian territory and subject to raids. Growing up, Joan saw Burgundian troops sack her village. What no one knew, though, even her parents, was that Joan heard voices. They came to her in light, using the language of angels. First, the Archangel Michael, then Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Initially, they just gave her religious and moral instructions. But when she was 16, they gave her a mission. For months, English and French troops had been locked in a stalemate at the city of Orleans. The voices wanted her to save the city. The voice told me that I should raise the siege laid to the city of Orleans, recalled Joan. And me? I answered it that I was a poor girl who knew not how to ride nor lead a war. Wait, what is that sound? Oh, look everyone, it's our friend the Context Fairy. Have you come to sprinkle asterisks into our episode?
I'd love that.
What have you got for us? Oh boy, we're gonna have to do most of this in lies. Sorry, Rob, but here's the gist. Joan of Arc is one of the best documented people of medieval Europe. I know it sounds amazing, but this illiterate peasant left a paper trail longer than many kings. And that's largely because of two spectacular trials. The condemnation trial that opened this episode, and the later nullification trial that overturned her conviction for heresy. But it's hard to untangle.
So she does get convicted, but then she's... okay. But was she made not guilty, like, after the fact? Because I know you can nullify something after somebody's dead. And it's sort of to, like, just kind of set the record straight. I don't know.
Nullification trial that overturned her conviction for heresy. But it's hard to untangle whether the story we get from these records is completely true. For the condemnation trial, we get verbatim transcripts of Joan describing her life and visions. But this was also a rigged court, set up by her enemies, and she was arguing for her life. Therefore, it's possible she may have changed details or added to her visions in hopes of convincing the judges that these messages were in line with Catholic thinking. Like,
oh, so he thinks that she may have had like the motivation to lie. Like I was hesitant at first to say like maybe she's lying, I don't know. But like I'm kind of waiting for somebody who knows a little bit better to say something that would give me reason to believe that. But I suppose if you're fighting for your life, but if you're like a true Kool-Aid drinker, then well, okay. It's complicated because if you're going to be like condemned by the church that you love and are devoted to, what's worse, to die being honest and standing by it, or to lie in order to convince the church that you were correct? Like, I don't know how somebody weighs that stuff because I don't have that same sort of connection to like a formal religious institution. So okay, that's complex. I like the layers there.
by contrast, the nullification trial, which happened 25 years after her death, mind you,
Oh,
was
there we
rigged
go.
by her allies to vindicate her. And they did that by collecting testimony from anyone who'd ever met or known Joan. But of course, that was after she'd become a martyred hero, which in all honesty, probably colored people's memories. So can we believe these accounts of her early life and visions? Well, maybe. For the sake of this story, we're going to trust them. But it's always good to remember that some bias may be at work.
Blessing Club,
But, okay,
I want that
back
shirt. Oh my god, yeah.
But it's always
That's a oh, these guys are total nerds. They like wrestling. That's based on a very popular pro wrestling shirt. It's based on the Bullet Club, which like in pro wrestling, there's the idea of like the foreign menace, and in the United States we'd have like a Russian guy or whatever come in, or an Iranian guy. It just depends on whatever the foreign conflict of the time is. But in Japan they had the Bullet Club, which started largely as a lot of Westerners who were like causing trouble. So I like that. I kind of want that
It's
shirt.
good to remember that some bias may be at work. But okay, back to Orleans. Why was it so important? Well, for starters, it was strategically vital, providing access to the Loire River. If it fell, the English could finally roll up the Dauphins territory. in
These
southern
borders
France.
are hard
But it
to
was also
these borders are hard to wrap my brain around. I'm so stuck in the time that I study.
English could finally roll up the Dauphins territory in southern France. But it was also psychologically important, because this awful stalemate had come to symbolize this whole phase of the war. You see, when King Charles VI and Queen Isabeau agreed to disinherit the Dauphins and make King Henry of England heir to the French throne, that was game. All Henry had to do was live longer than King Charles, and he would be the legitimate King of France.
She served her angels and not the church. Okay. And that would, if that's the case, that would keep her from, that would ideally keep her from lying to, if she had to like get through this to fulfill the mission of her angels, though, would she be willing to lie to help her I don't know. That's so, like, I could twist this in a million different ways, and it's hard to put yourself in somebody's mind when you don't know them that well. But I'm just trying to like appreciate how complex her situation is, I suppose.
And that was supposed to be easy mode, since Charles was mentally ill, in poor health, and 18 years his elder. But then, Henry dropped dead at 35. Charles died 2 months later, leaving the French crown in the hands of Henry's 9-month-old son. So in the north, you had a claimant to the throne, supported by a treaty, who was too young to be crowned for 15 years. And in the south, you had a claimant that had the right bloodline, but who was disinherited and couldn't get to the city where all French kings must be crowned. When both kings were alive, people knew what they were fighting
It's
for.
complicated.
Now, the conflict
Super
had become
complicated.
a rudderless stalemate, with both sides lacking inspiring leadership or the comfort of a righteous cause. Joan's mission was to guide the Armagnacs into a holy war,
Yeah, that is one of the arguments that I read a lot about in like the little paper that I did on her. Like, what was she? Was she this exceptional leader, or was she a symbol? I don't want to use the word mascot, but yeah, she would be like this, more the idea at the head of the army rather than just like the sword. She's the cause. She provides a degree of righteousness to what they do. It's something to fight for. I don't know how good she was as an actual like military figure, but she certainly provided motivation.
After receiving her task, Joan slipped out of her village, made her way to a nearby town, and demanded to see the garrison commander. She was on a mission from God, she said. He must provide her with an escort and deliver her to the Dauphin. The commander was not too pleased with this delusional girl and told her to go back home. But Joan came back, twice, and each time with more followers from the town and surrounding countryside. Eventually, he gave in, and some of his soldiers would accompany Joan to the Dauphin's court. But the road they would take wound through Burgundian territory, a dangerous proposition for a soldier, and even more perilous for a teenaged girl traveling alone with rough men. So Joan's supporters, the peasants and families of the town, decided she should ride in disguise. Joan cut her hair short, and the townspeople gifted her a horse, a sword, and a suit of men's campaigning clothes, the kind that tied together so they were hard to remove by force. And after her long journey, her entrance into court caused a sensation. This young girl had traveled nearly 200 miles through enemy territory to bring the Dauphin a divine message. She'd even dressed like a man to guard her chastity. And that presented a bit of a theological problem. You see, Joan was not the first.
Yeah, women are not supposed to dress like men. That is the thing. That's what got her, isn't it? That out of all the things she does, that's the thing that takes her down, like her cross-dressing.
Holy woman who wanted to share religious visions with the Dauphin. He already had one visit him a decade before, and another who'd taken up residence in a cemetery to preach her visions. But they were a little more orthodox. Joan's message was a political one, and the manner of her dress violated Old Testament rules against women wearing men's clothing. But the issue was, Charles and his court absolutely believed that God sent angels and saints to speak to people. And if Joan's visions were indeed divine, turning her away might bring the wrath of God the Father on his already precarious court. Plus, her message that Charles was indeed the true king was a needed morale boost, and she was a celebrity with a following. People were writing books about her. On the other hand, they also believed that demons could masquerade as angels. And if Joan were a pawn of Satan, inviting her into his court would similarly damn Charles's efforts to regain his rightful throne.
And how would one know?
He was nervous about looking foolish.
It's like, no way.
So he ordered an investigation. There would be a discernment of spirits, a series of tests to conclude whether Joan's mysterious voices came from heaven or hell. First, a physical examination. Joan called herself La Pucelle, the maid. And that didn't just mean young girl. That meant a virgin. This was a sticking point, because medieval theologians believed only virgin women could receive divine visions. But after retiring to a private area, a group of noble women and nuns said she checked out. With that established, Charles then sent her to a group of theologians in order to examine her visions and beliefs. Were they orthodox? Heretical? Did they have a hint of brimstone, perhaps? Was she a virtuous person? Joan came back with a clean bill of spiritual health. She was virtuous and sincere, the theologians said.
Very nice.
But they couldn't be sure if her messages really came from a divine source. But not to worry. They'd also come up with an easy way to check. Send her to Orleans. That's right. Fit this teenaged maid out in armor. Send her with the reinforcements that were already headed to the city. And see what she could do. If she managed to break this intractable 6-month siege, they would be pretty darn sure that God was with her. And if not, well, the most they'd lose would be a horse, a suit of armor, and some men who were going there anyway. They sent Joan into a crash course of medieval combat, training her to ride a warhorse and move in plate armor, teaching her basic tactics. Then, they presented her with a white banner embroidered with Charles's fleur-de-lis symbol of the Trinity, and her chosen symbol, the names of Jesus and Mary. And scholars, for their part, worked overtime digging into obscure prophecies that might support Joan. There had been a long-standing tradition that a maid would emerge to save France, and they marshaled every scrap they could find to support that, including a prediction that supposedly came from Merlin.
Merlin! Oh my god, you're joking.
So backed by shaky prophecies and in a suit of unfamiliar armor, the 17-year-old Joan rode off to war.
That's amazing. I mean, sometimes mythology... Some people believe it, you know? There's something there. It just sounds ridiculous on the face of it, but like that doesn't mean like they were insane to think of it at the time. It might have been normal to think of. Oh god, really, Merlin? Oh lordy lord. Okay, this is a direction that we're going in. Let's just do the next one. So I think there's 5 episodes of this. This will take us through and beyond the halfway point. Wow.
From Joan of Arc, March 22nd, 1429. King of England, render unto the maid here sent by God the keys of all the good.
Okay, maybe this is a normal thing. Maybe people I'm not super familiar with the history of the time. Maybe people reference Merlin all the time, and like think of regionally where this is, where that kind of mythology might be relevant. I don't want to laugh at them because it's different time, different culture, different a lot of things, but still on the face of it, you can't help but laugh a little.
England, render unto the maid here sent by God the keys of all the good towns which you have taken and violated in France. And you, archers, companions of war, men at arms before Orleans, go away to your country by God. And if you do not, expect news of the maid who will come to see you shortly, to your very great injury. King of England, if you do not do so, I am a chieftain of war, and in whatever place I find your people in France, I will make them flee. And if they will not obey, I will have them slain. Ooh, Zoe, you feel that? I'm getting tingles.
It's pretty rad. It's metal, I think.
It was a strange procession that came to relieve the besieged city of Orleans. At the front were not troops, but priests singing hymns and carrying banners. Then came the soldiers, and more numerous than either were the carts full of supplies. And leading them was Joan, dressed in plate armor, astride a white horse. Her pages and squires rode behind, carrying her new banner. It was a column of the devoted. The forces who saw her, Armagnac in the city and English and Burgundian outside, were all exhausted. At the beginning of the siege, the Armagnacs had centered their defenses around the south bank of the Loire, where a quarter-mile bridge, the only way to cross the river, was anchored by a gatehouse. But the English had...
So before they continue, I guess I'll acknowledge this right about off the bat. Before we go any further, I've considered this. I'm always going to be a little bit ignorant when it comes to a lot of these extra history things because they're histories of events more often than they are histories of actual people. As much as they try to contextualize who the people are and try to understand as much of what they think, a lot of these are like top-down histories. Even though we're starting with a peasant woman who rose to power, it's still a very top-down political military history, and it can only explain so much in the time that they have what ordinary people's lives were like and how they thought and what a lot of this religious imagery and symbolism means. There's only so much time to put into all that, so I recognize where my ignorance is. I just feel like it's important to point that out when I make comments. They do come from a place often of ignorance, unless I can find some sort of parallel. Sorry, there was a flyer right in front of me. I was trying to get it, but I missed it. There it is. There it is. keep missing it. Some sort of a parallel or cultural understanding that I have studied. I just kind of fall short sometimes.
The only way to cross the river was anchored by a gatehouse. But the English had taken that gatehouse in an assault, forcing the Armagnacs to blow the bridge and cut the city off. The English responded by making the gatehouse their headquarters and building a number of earthen forts around Orleans. This meant that the city was surrounded, but supplies could still slip through if they were swift and protected. Joan's party was armed, and before the English could sally out, they'd reached the bank of the Loire, where ferries could carry them into the city. But there was a problem. When they boarded, the wind wasn't right. The troops and supplies couldn't get across. In fact, now they were vulnerable. If they remained pinned to the bank, the English could marshal forces to wipe them out. Then the wind changed. Upon her arrival, jubilation filled Orleans.
Many histories and philosophers of ancient Greece may not have actually existed, but to this day their works are studies. I believe that within Merlin is the same. Yeah, I think it's a good parallel there. Like one might in ancient Greece might reference Odysseus. Maybe more in a way that makes him feel more like a historical character than a fictional character. So yeah, there's parallels there. It just feels silly. As for some reason, I feel like the Greeks get away with it more. I think they get away with that stuff just a little bit more.
Joan rode through the narrow streets. Throngs reached out to touch her, hoping for a blessing. These people had heard of this maid, the one prophesied to save France, the one who had brought them food, the one God had sent to them on a miraculous wind. She took quarters in a house set aside for her and received a welcome from the city's commanders. And that's when Joan found out that not all was as she expected it to be. Her visions had told her to lead the Armagnac army. But these military men weren't interested in taking orders from a teenager.
No.
They welcomed her supplies, sure, and the morale boost she brought was amazing. They invited her to councils of war, where they explained the tactical subtleties of
if she dies on the battlefield, that would kill morale.
Siege warfare. And they even conceded that maybe she was on a mission from God. But sieges, they explained, were won by tons of supplies, artillery angles, and precise strategic planning. Success came in months, not days. They would wear down one earthwork, then the next, they told her. Joan, however, had developed an alternative strategy, an intricate plan to dislodge the English from their positions. It went like this, and follow me closely for a minute because this gets a little bit complicated and into the weeds of siege warfare. But her plan was, get 'em. Like full frontal attack, right now, on the strongest position. Huh? After all, God was with them, and would reward their faith with victory. Upon hearing this plan, the commanders weren't so keen. They didn't want to waste lives and supplies on an attack that, even if successful, might damage the garrison in the long term. Plus, if it failed, they'd squander the high morale drummed up by Joan's arrival. Their plan was to go a little more of the Captain America route, using Joan as a mascot, sending her out
mascot, there we go. I was hesitant to use the term mascot earlier, so I'm kind of glad that he said it before I started feeling really bad about the whole thing.
Soldiers pay. Not to put her in a place where she might get her head shot off with a cannon, which, side note, was a very real threat. The previous English commander had died from just such a lucky shot. But Joan was not about to be some lucky charm. She did the meet and greet duties, but also slipped outside the walls and observed enemy positions. During one outing, she walked to the edge of the destroyed bridge and called the English to surrender. Their commander responded with a rain of insults, calling her a witch, a coward, and saying that the French had taken her from a brothel and put her in armor. He would later regret those insults, but Joan's activities also won over the citizens of Orleans, because unlike the city commanders, Joan was fresh, she promised a quick victory, and she did things like ride out to escort new trains of supplies into the city. And as a result, support for Joan grew. When she rode into the streets, she could barely move due to the crowds. And on one occasion, a mob broke down the door to her house, desperate to see and touch her. Within days, it was clear to the commanders that some kind of action was needed to relieve the pressure. So, They picked an easy target, a less defended earthwork, but also didn't tell Joan, fearing she'd rush to the battle line. And yeah, they were right.
There we go.
Upon being woken and told of the attack, Joan strapped on her armor and rushed to join the troops. Not to fight, but to inspire. She carried her banner, displaying herself, urging them on. And they won. Hours of hard fighting gave the Armagnac defenders their first victory in months. Faith in the Holy Maid soared even higher. The populace sensed imminent liberation. But while the townsmen and soldiers celebrated, Joan turned inward. She'd preached holy warfare and the defeat of the English, but she'd never until now witnessed combat up close. It was awful, a far cry from the glorious victory she'd imagined. This was sadness, though, not doubt. God's will was not to be questioned. So the next day, with the fighting
I mean, God sanctions violence all the time in the Old Testament. Like, I don't know. I can't think of as many examples in the New Testament, but yeah, he sanctions violence all the time. So yeah, it's only natural, she's human, that she would feel kind of like remorse that she has to do it, but with still the recognition that she has to do it.
Suspended due to a religious feast, she presented a revamped plan. Get 'em! Not the small fort this time, the biggest, baddest English bastion on the North Bank. The one with the most men. Again, the commanders compromised. They would cross the river on pontoon bridges and attack the weaker forts on the south bank, taking the earthworks in front of the bridge. Then that done, they would attack the gatehouse. Now, was that get 'em enough for Joan? It was.
Cool.
The next day, the army marshaled at the city gates when they noticed.
There is something kind of cool that these guys have to keep. They have to satisfy Joan. Like, they're not like subjugating Joan. Joan has influence. They have to make sure that she is satisfied with what they are doing. It's kind of interesting. It's not just like they've turned her into a mascot and that's what she is. They've turned her into a mascot, but also this is as if like the mascot has like a, I don't know, let's say a 1/3 stake in decisions, I guess, that they make. And like that's a significant amount of influence and has like a degree of veto power.
That their numbers were larger than usual. The citizens of Orleans had flocked to Joan, organizing militias to fight for their maid. The commanders tried to get them to leave, but she insisted that they come. Joan's second day of battle was hard. The English had abandoned their outer works to concentrate forces in front of the gatehouse. She led the first attack personally, before the Armagnac forces were fully across the river, and was beaten back. The English pursued, only checked when Joan turned and bellowed for them to stop in the name of God.
Those guys have to satisfy. Don't be like that. Don't be like that. That you know that's not what I meant.
God. Context fairy, don't think I don't see you.
Bonk.
We're just having a little fun. And then it was a grinding, earthwork by earthwork battle. Joan led the assault, waving her banner and urging the troops on. She limped, one foot pierced by an English caltrop. It was bloody, but by nightfall, the Armagnacs held the earthworks around the gatehouse. The next day, they closed in. Citizens repaired the bridge to hit the gatehouse from two sides. Cannons bombarded the thick stonework. They even sent burning boats in a fruitless attempt to burn the English out, but none of it worked. And as it neared dark, the commanders decided to starve the gatehouse into submission. Joan heard this and grabbed a ladder, because it was time to, and say it with me now, get 'em.
Get
She
'em.
ran toward the last earthwork. Soldiers snatched up scaling ladders and followed her. They would take it by escalade, one of the most dangerous operations in medieval warfare, climbing ladders face first into the blades and missiles of the enemy. Joan threw herself into a ditch, passed off the ladder, and took her banner, yelling that God was with them. Thwack! An arrow slammed into the gap between her helmet and breastplate, and buried itself deep in her shoulder.
I didn't know she ever got wounded.
Carried off the battlefield by her pages. The English jeered that they'd slain the witch, and the attack stalled, men dying in the ditch as they tried to climb their way into English arrows. Rumors of the maid's death were rampant. And then, from behind the French ranks, a white banner rose. Joan stalked back toward the embankment, clad in battered armor. Each step would have been agony. It had only been a flesh wound, but doctors would have had to pull the arrow
It was only a
through her
flesh
shoulder
wound.
in order to dislodge it. She insisted on rejoining the attack.
Dude, that is the
Their maid
worst.
arisen. Seemingly unwounded, the French rallied and scaled the final earthwork. English and Burgundian soldiers evacuated to the gatehouse, swarming across the drawbridge in such numbers that the timbers snapped, dropping a handful of men into the Loire River. Among the drowned was the English captain who'd cursed Joan only a few days before. They'd take the gatehouse by nightfall. The next day, Joan drew up her army on the north bank, in front of the English forts there. And to be clear, it was her army now. Sure, other men might command it, but these soldiers fought for her, for this strange holy maid who'd bled with them in battle. She didn't order an attack. The sight of—
So I'm starting to have like a greater appreciation for her than I did walking into this. Like, the more this goes on, the more I kind of appreciate her more than I did. Like, at first I thought of her as more symbolic, and yes, she is very much, if not mostly, symbolic, but that is often what inspires people to fight with a sense of purpose. So honestly, symbolism, it can often like take the back seat to pragmatism, but I think in this case she deserves all the credit in the world.
her force was enough to get the English to withdraw. Joan had done what the voices commanded. In 4 days of battle, she'd ended a siege that had dragged on for 6 months. She had her miracle, and none doubted her mission or her power. She saved
pretty
the
rad.
Dauphin and opened the door to northern France. And for her next trick, she would give the Dauphin a crown.
Cool.
Special thanks
Let's see what we got. We got 2 more, I
to
think.
Jesus Maria, Duke of Burgundy. Joan the Maid
Heroine or
requests of
heretic,
you,
okay.
in the name of the King of Heaven, that the King of France and yourself should make a good, firm, lasting peace. I beg and request of you, with clasped hands, to not fight any battles, nor wage war against us. Neither yourself, your troops, nor subjects, and know beyond a doubt that despite whatever number of soldiers you bring against us, they will never win. And there will be tremendous heartbreak from the great clash, and from the blood that will spill from those who come against us.
Dude, Joe's a beast.
July 17th, 1429, Arles Cathedral. 4 months before, Joan had met with
Sorry, hearing people who are not like French speakers say things that with like a very French accent, it just sounds like grunting.
1429, Arles Cathedral. 4 months before, Joan had met with the Dauphin Charles in private. There, she had promised him that she would relieve the siege of Orleans and bring him to Arles, where all French monarchs were crowned. And while this message from the King of Heaven was welcome, it also seemed incredible. Then, the season of miracles began. After her victory at Orleans, Joan had pressed Charles to take the castles and bridges along the Loire. They'd fallen one by one, with Joan personally leading the troops to the walls. When the English had set up an ambush between 2 woods, it could have been another Agincourt, but a stag, spooked by the army, had disordered the English ranks. With Joan at the head, Armagnac forces smashed into the English, finally avenging that long-ago defeat. Now, the English were evacuating the Loire Valley. She insisted Charles push for Arras. It was a stretch. The city lay deep in English territory, but she had done it. City after city surrendered to her without a fight, opening their gates after she drafted letters that promised clemency from
God is on her side.
and destruction if they defied
I'm a
him.
believer.
Only one resisted.
Maybe.
The same city where the Dauphin's parents had signed a treaty disinheriting him. Yet there too, Joan prevailed. The city's spiritual leader, an apocalypse-preaching friar known for conducting ceremonies.
I like that it was a flat
The
earth.
city's spiritual leader, an
really
apocalypse-preaching
funny.
friar known for conducting ceremonies where citizens burned board games and beauty products in a bonfire of the vanities, had been so impressed with Joan that he switched sides. The city capitulated after 4 days of Joan parading her banner outside the walls, and the friar now served in her retinue. Joan had brought Charles to arms without a
Get
single
off my
death
keyboard,
in battle.
dude.
And now, the Dauphin. No, not the Dauphin anymore. The new king stood among the grand men of his
Dude.
kingdom, anointed with the oil of Clovis, wearing a crown. Joan stood by the king's side with her banner, watching her divine work fulfilled, and her family had been invited and looked on at their daughter, a shepherdess who now wore armor, drank fine wine, and had a staff of servants. It was a perfect moment, the last perfect moment.
Oh yeah,
with her
she
divine
going
task
down.
complete, Joan entered a strange time. She'd done what she set out to do. So now what? Up to this point, all of her actions had a focus, an ordained mission she knew was righteous, a shining light that illuminated the path.
Yeah, in this case, if we do grant her that like everything she said she sincerely believes, she's never made any decision just for herself or just for France or just for Charles or just for anyone in particular. She did it for a higher cause. So it's like she's like a purely religious figure, like who doesn't have anything left. Like now what do you do what secular choices do you make, or are there secular choices to be made? Do you just go back to what your life was before? I don't know. Hard to go back from where she's been.
Her voices still spoke, though. Still said it was her mission to drive the English from France. But
Oh,
before,
okay.
they
He does
had
have
a
something to
plan.
do.
Relieve Orleans, crown Charles. Now they were getting a little lighter on the specifics. And also, things politically were getting a great deal murkier. Previously, she'd fought the English exclusively, but now she was on the cusp of a campaign where she'd battle fellow Frenchmen, Burgundians, the false French as the Armagnacs like to call them, but it still felt different. Joan was also embroiled in the profane world of politics. Once Charles got a crown, the first thing he did was to enter truce negotiations with the Burgundians. It was sensible. His treasury couldn't sustain a continued conflict, and there was new territory to consolidate. But negotiations meant give and take, offering to recognize the Duke of Burgundy's powers over the lands given to him by the English, for example, or saying Burgundy didn't have to treat Charles as king. This frustrated Joan. She wanted a truce, sure, and had even sent her own letter to the Duke of Burgundy, but she wanted a truce that acknowledged Charles as king. After all, was not God on their side? And if so, why make a deal with these false French, who had not submitted to the will of the King of Heaven?
Dude, that's one of those things, like, that would make me believe that she's more sincere than he is. Like, he had nothing to do with her visions or anything like that. He doesn't really necessarily have any sort of obligation to go through with her vision unless, like, he believes them to be sincere. If he believes them to be sincere, then to compromise is senseless. So this totally destroys Joan's worldview. That's weird. Like, that is so complicated, and it's like one of those things. I when it comes to kings, I almost never believe that they are like full-on believers unless they're just like also sociopaths, because a lot of their actions often conflict with things, but they're also like people who are able to convince themselves that they are right no matter what and don't really care about like all that other stuff. So I never know how to really feel about a king, but I'm always skeptical.
To Joan, this was as much a pilgrimage as it was a war. If the armies of France marched with faith in their ultimate victory, God would grant them that victory. He had before. And indeed, Joan's supreme faith and inspirational from-the-front leadership style had broken a deadlock that simple military strategy had found intractable. But the larger fact was that logistics, army pay, and other details had also come into the equation. And the king's
God ain't
advisors
paying their
were
bills.
increasingly shutting her out of the inner circle. So therefore, it was almost a relief when the Burgundians broke their truce by reinforcing Paris, and the king was persuaded to attack the city. Joan had advocated this course before, and once again, she was in the front line, helping place cannons and arguing for her favorite tactic of get 'em! Charles was, let's say, less enthusiastic. Paris was a risky venture, but he had agreed to an all-out assault with Joan attacking the city's main gatehouse. On the Feast of the Nativity of Our Lady, she unfurled her banner and went to the front. But Paris was unlike any other place she'd ever attacked. It was the best defended city in France, and the Burgundians holding it had popular support. Joan's attack smashed against the defense, with Joan yelling up at the walls for the Burgundians to surrender. They replied with a squall of crossbow bolts. One slammed deep into Joan's thigh. The man carrying her banner was nailed to the earth by his foot, and when he put up his visor to wiggle the quarrel free, a follow-up shot ran through his face. Her pages dragged Joan to the rear, and
that poor whoever that guy was
furious for her to rejoin the battle. Charles sounded the retreat. Losses from the first day of the siege were heavy enough that he would not authorize a second. There would be no miracle this time. Joan had her first defeat, and Charles instead formed a truce with the Burgundians, leaving the capital still in enemy hands. And that called some things into question. After all, if Joan's victory at Orleans
was she a fluke? Was it merely a fluke? Were they going to break the siege anyway? Who knows?
Was a miracle? Why hadn't heaven similarly intervened at Paris? Everyone went in search of justification. Joan's allies suggested that perhaps she had succumbed to pride and overambition, and that God had simply humbled her. Others said God had withdrawn his support because she attacked on a feast day, usually considered too holy for war. And her enemies claimed that it was evidence she was a witch, and her victory at Orleans
she's going down,
and that the Almighty instead had heard the prayers of Paris's defenders. And the questions, they were getting harder. People were writing her to ask which pope to support, enlisting her to condemn Czech rebels who had insisted the Catholic Church was corrupt and in need of reform. And she could not explain the defeat in Paris. What did that mean? The truce left her cooling her heels, resting and writing letters, increasingly distant from the king. Then came the gifts. For her service, Charles ennobled Joan and her family, making them minor members of the nobility, and declared her home village exempt from taxation.
And somebody earlier said that her house is still a place. So that must be like, I'm gonna have to look into that later because I'm curious to what kind of shape it's in at this point. It's been a long time.
This was essentially an honorable discharge, a suggestion that her moment had passed, she'd done what she'd promised, and that she should just go home. Charles had decided that his miraculous shepherdess should be put out to pasture. But Joan refused to go. She was a soldier, and she would continue to fight. And thankfully, before the pressure got too great, she was given an assignment. A city was about to come under siege by a combined English and Burgundian force, and she would help relieve it. It wasn't a glorious mission, but the besieged needed her. So, she went.
Give her something to do.
May 23rd, 1430. A raid. Joan and her troops enter the Burgundian camp, ready to sack the supplies. This way, when the enemy reaches the city, the besiegers will have little to eat. Then, shouts. She sees Burgundian troops emerging from ambush. Thousands of enemies ready to cut them off. It had been a trap. Her forces flee to the bridge. Men shout for her to cross, to get back into the city. But Joan the Maid does not run from battle. She will stand with her men in the rear guard, letting others escape. Even when
I was about to say, this is when she gets like totally surrounded, and this is her actual rest. This is something that I actually recall reading about. Out of the few things that I remember about her, this is one of those things that was painted rather vividly.
1,000 ambushers encircled the rear guard, cutting them off from the bridge. Even when her enemies surround her, she holds her banner, urges her comrades to fight in the name of God, until an archer hauls her from the saddle. She insists that she will only surrender to their officer. After all, she is an ennobled soldier of France, the Maid of Orleans. Her rank demands nothing less. But these Burgundians don't ransom her back to Charles like any other knight. They move her from prison to prison for nearly a year. Joan tries to escape her.
She's too important symbolically. This could crush them. Just like morale-wise.
First prison by breaking through the floor. In response, they move her to a tower.
She's persistent.
Castle. More months pass. Joan stares out the window, heartsick over the besieged city she couldn't rescue. Every day, her voices tell her she mustn't jump. Then Joan hears she's been sold to the English. She decides she would rather die trying to flee than be a prisoner of her enemies. But it's 70 feet to the ground, and if she jumps, she could very well kill herself. And suicide is a mortal sin. Her voices tell Joan not to do it. They insist that God will rescue her. She, in turn, ignores them, puts one foot on
She
the
goes
ledge,
anyway.
and launches herself into the night.
So she's gonna make it, because this is not how she goes. So the next thing is called Heroine or Heretic, and I believe that's the end. So we're gonna actually see how she was sentenced and what resulted in her, I guess, being, what caused her to be burnt at the stake and become like synonymous with like witch burnings. There we go.
February 21st, 1431, Rouen Castle. Do you swear to speak the truth in answer to such questions as are put to you? Asks Bishop Cauchon. I do not know what you wish to examine me on, responds Joan. Perhaps you might ask such things I would not tell. Will you swear to speak the truth upon those things which are asked of you concerning your faith, which you know? Concerning my father and mother, and what I've done since I took the road to France, I will gladly swear to tell the truth. But concerning my revelations from God, these I have never told or revealed to anyone, save only to Charles, my king, and I will not reveal them to save my head. It's the first day of Joan's inquisitional trial for heresy. She is both the defendant and the only witness, and she's arguing for her life.
Layers. Wait. Yeah, again, layers. I was about to say, was that like teasing this? But no, that was also the conditions of her first trial.
Joan survived the leap from the tower, landing on a soft patch of earth. But the fall had gone badly, and she laid injured until her jailers collected her, her voices whispering comfort. But her worry came to pass. The Burgundians sold her to the English, and there would be a trial for witchcraft and heresy conducted by her enemies. As they prepared, Joan languished in prison. English and Burgundian lords visited to Lirat and Groper. She was constantly alone with male soldiers. She still wore men's clothing, though, for it was a greater defense against assault than a dress. Outside her cell, the inquisitional trial was taking shape. At its head was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a clergyman who'd been a long supporter of English interests in France. In fact, he'd personally negotiated Joan's sale to the English. So this trial was not exactly fair, because you see, after Joan got Charles crowned at Arras, the English, not to be outdone, had rushed their boy king, Henry VI, into the country in order to crown him King of France. But Charles was still claiming, through Joan, that God supported his claim. However, if Cauchon could prove in court that Joan was either a heretic, a witch, or a liar, it would go a long way toward undercutting Charles's claim to the throne. It was a trial designed to discredit Joan and her visions. Yet Cauchon knew it couldn't be an obvious hit job. Everyone knew the English and Burgundians hated Joan and expected a slanted court. Therefore, the verdict must be unimpeachable. Cauchon insisted on following strict procedure, enlisting some of the finest theological minds in France to serve as examiners. Every questioning session, every move by the court, every piece of evidence would be recorded. He wanted everyone to know how they'd come to their conclusions. Yet his initial background investigation wasn't promising. An investigator sent to Doremy to dig up dirt came back empty-handed, and a group of English noblewomen confirmed Joan was a virgin, meaning she wasn't lying about being a maid. But that still left the charge of heresy, of harboring beliefs that differed from established church doctrine. And if
I'm excited to learn about this stuff because in my where I live, we have such a big history surrounding these kinds of trials, though not at it wouldn't be considered at this level of importance, but here they're considered very important, in our own history. And we're right next door to Massachusetts. Salem is a few hours drive.
Joan refused to recant. That was a death sentence. So the dance began. Joan insisted that they let her take Mass. The prosecutor, for his part, insisted that she could not hear Mass while dressed as a man, and Joan countered that her garments protected her. Then the questioning portion of the trial opened, with Joan standing in a castle hall amid 50 or 60 churchmen. Now,
They really do just get her on wearing men's clothing, right? That's really it. It's like getting Al Capone on tax evasion. It's like, there are some other things you want to get her on, but you're settling to get her on wearing men's clothing.
he had an audience. Joan began sparring with the court over her oath to be truthful. She agreed to answer questions about her past and her faith, but not her visions. It was an argument that would repeat every day. And over the next week and a half, the court would probe her about her past, her beliefs, and every step of her journey since leaving Dorami. They asked about whether she had disobeyed her parents by leaving, about obscure village folk beliefs, and of course, about her visions. Her examiners were learned men, versed in theology, and with decades of education in canon law. Joan, by contrast, was...
There is kind of a, like, let's say that maybe she's not honest. Like, if they get her on record, they may be more capable to contradict her and, like, demonstrate how, like, maybe what she's getting is not grounded in theology as they know it. I don't know.
was an illiterate peasant who had only recently learned to sign her name on the letters she dictated. Yet, she pushed back. Her voices told her to be bold, to argue, to challenge. And though not traditionally schooled, she had a sharp mind and had absorbed much in her years as a devoted Catholic. On the third day, when the inquisitors asked her whether she believed she would go to heaven, the court held its breath. Because, yes, thank you, Admiral, it was a trap. If Joan said no, she would be admitting a state of sin. But if she said yes, she would contradict church doctrine that humans could not truly know whether they were in grace. So either way, it would be an admission of heresy.
Oh, come on, that's bull. They're taking advantage of the fact that she may not be... Like, I think if she were literate, she would be very aware of this. Like, she's clearly super dedicated to her religious practices or whatever. She's really put a lot of time into that, but she's probably just at the mercy of her illiteracy at this point.
If I am not in his grace, she answered, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in his grace. Her
Oh, never mind. I thought they were gonna get her there. That's a perfect answer, probably.
eloquence on the issues stunned the court. Questions of faith she batted away with ease that puzzled her questioners, and Joan reveled in this performance. But when speaking of visions, though, she evaded, circled, outright refused. And this was wise, because she was not as well versed in church doctrine involving spiritual beings, and if she spoke about it, might unknowingly create an opening. For days, Kashaw and the Inquisitors hammered at her. Who told you to wear men's clothing? Why did you do it, despite the fact the Old Testament forbids it? Name the voices. Convince us you've seen the saints. He urged Joan to describe her visions beyond seeing
Pretty
light
sure
and
that's going to be
hearing
her
voices.
response.
Was it the voice of God, saints, or angels? If saints, did they give her a sign to convince others that her visions were real? This, too, was a snare. You see, church doctrine held that saints and angels were beings of pure spirit, and they had no corporeal bodies. So if Joan described seeing them in the flesh, you get where he was going. He took away her audience and began questioning her in private in her cell. The cracks began to show. She said the voices were the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, and that they appeared to her, solid as her inquisitors, and she knew them by the symbols they carried. And
Oh,
when pressed,
no.
Joan described a vision she'd had at Charles's court, where an angel
You
walked
blew it,
into the
Joan.
audience hall and placed a jeweled
blew
crown
it.
on the Dauphin's
They
head.
got you.
But she still refused to reveal exactly what she'd said to the Dauphin in private. And finally, Cauchon considered using torture. And indeed, he showed Joan the implements, hoping the sight of these tools of pain would force a confession. But they did not. However, Joan was already ill, and they did worry that if they tortured her, she might die in custody. So tabling torture, they drew up their findings and read them to her. 12 charges. She would need to answer them the next day. May 24th, 1431. Joan stands on a scaffold in a graveyard, formally charged with heresy. The prosecutors had determined that either she had fabricated the visions, or they were demons. Then, a surprise. If she doesn't...
I mean, there's no mental health pleading here, is there? Like, that perhaps this is... I don't want to, like, give her, like, an actual, like, fake diagnosis here, but, like, it's some sort of, like, some kind of schizophrenia or whatever, like, I don't know. Like, they don't think that way. If she did have some sort of a mental ailment, they would probably just be like, no, that's what demons do. That's what they do. That's their thing.
Answer these charges, they say. They will execute sentence immediately. Joan's voices had promised that they'd deliver her from captivity, but now time was up. She gave in to fear and confessed. The inquisitors had not expected that.
Oh, what?
But they were delighted. After all, the best outcome of a heresy trial was one where the accused recanted and was welcomed back into the church. Joan would live, just in captivity. They shaved her head, put her in the dress she'd so resisted. But 2 days later, Cauchon got a message. He rushed to...
And she was all like, nope, I lied.
She was back in men's clothes, agitated. One story said her guards had assaulted her. Another claimed they'd forced her into her old clothing. She babbled. Her voices were angry that she had recanted out of fear, and she worried God would turn her away. A confessed heretic could live, but one who returned to their sin must die. And so, the next day, they burned her in the old marketplace. I
didn't know that she caved in even for a moment there. That's a huge bit of development there. I don't know how to perfectly make sense of it, but it's fascinating.
One English soldier held a cross high so she could look at it as the flames consumed her, and the executioner ensured that nothing was left. No bones the faithful could venerate. And finally, they threw her ashes into a river. Cauchon spread the transcripts across Europe to show they'd been right to convict her. King Charles reportedly swore vengeance for her death, but he made no public statements. In fact,
It seems like King Charles... she may have thought that he was more fond of her than she actually was, from like the small bits that I got from their the relationship between the two. Like, she was a convenient tool for him. I don't know how much he actually bought into all of this stuff either.
He had a new holy youth, a shepherd boy that showed the stigmata. In time, the English killed him too. But if the English had hoped that Joan's death would change the course of the war, they were wrong. In 1449, 18 years after Joan's execution, Charles entered the English capital of Rouen in victory. The English were well on the way to being driven out of France. Where the father had been known as Charles the Beloved and Charles the Mad, the son would be known as Charles the Victorious.
Sick.
And part of that victory was
Good for that guy.
A retrial. Just as politically motivated as the first, that cleared Joan in 1453. Because in the 22 years since the first trial, politics had changed a great deal. With the Armagnac and Burgundian at peace, everyone was eager to rewrite history, recasting the war as one of French against English. And of course, Charles's continued success seemed to vindicate Joan's visions. Even people who had participated in the first trial emerged to denounce it as corrupted by politics. Joan was no longer a champion for the Armagnacs. This soldier from a bitter civil war was now seen as a champion of all of France. And her status as a national symbol would only grow over the centuries. And in 1920, the same church that had condemned Joan as a heretic officially declared her a saint. The girl who had defended Orleans, taken the Loire castles, and failed outside the walls of Paris had...
I didn't realize they waited so long to give her sainthood. I didn't realize it was in the 1900s. I thought it happened much earlier, but that's interesting.
Made one final conquest. For now, she'd stormed the gates of heaven.
Oh yeah, that was a cute finish right there. I like that. That's a good line. All right. So Joan of Arc is fascinating. And it's really what I like about her is my inability to put myself in her head. And that gives her kind of a mystique that I enjoy and am willing to learn more about her. I'd hate to switch gears. I mean, we're only slightly switching gears, but I do have an epic rap battle of history lined up. And I wanted to do it after we watch the extra history, because like I always miss a line or two. Like it doesn't hit as hard as I think it might to somebody who understands the history better. So maybe like I'll appreciate the ERB stuff a little bit more because now I watched this. We got Joan of Arc and Miley Cyrus. But it's a very particular Miley Cyrus. It's like the Miley Cyrus like right after she did her more, I don't want to use the word mature, but she we can't stop Miley Cyrus, you know, doing Molly and twerking, as they say. Like I never had a problem. She got a lot of crap during that time. I never really had too much problem. It's like, hey, you know, go. You're changing your public image. You're trying different stuff. You know, do your thing. Just, you know, take care of yourself or whatever. Don't go too far. If you want to experiment with drugs, that's one thing. Just, you know, try to keep that experimentation under control or whatever. You know, everybody's got to find themselves. That's how I always felt about the Miley Cyrus thing. Her versus Joan of Arc. I guess I could see why they have this. They kind of have kind of opposite imageries, especially during this time. Like their popular images would feel opposed to one another. So let's see what they got.
Joan of Arc versus Miley Cyrus. Let me get here to hate. We can stand in the autograph line and wait, cause I'm all twerk. I got all day. Make words in this French make face. You died a virgin, girl. Who you think you messing with? It's Miley Cyrus. I'm the hottest thing since Britney, bitch.
Okay, that's not a great line. I like the intensity, but it's not a great messing with Britney. It's not the best rhyme I've heard in my life. But you know, they're coming from very different places where like chastity and virginity is I guess it's very important in Joan's time, and in our time it's seen. And you know, we seem a little bit confused about how we feel about chastity sometimes. Sometimes you make fun of people for not having enough sex, and then you make fun of them for having too much sex, and like nobody's ever gonna be happy with that. So it's not the I don't know if Joan would be offended by that. I don't think she would. Oh!
When I grab the mic, I milk it. You could say this rap is like my alter ego, cause I killed it, Lord.
That was mostly like Miley Cyrus stuff, I think. If there's a lot of Joan related lines, I must have missed them. The steak line, that was a good one. The flow was fun. That was okay. Yeah. All right, Miley. It's very beatable. Miley is beatable. Joan can come back from this one.
Grab the mic, I milk it. You could say this rap is like my alter ego, cause I killed it.
Lord, forgive me for the words I speak. I know the voices of the angels tell me turn the other cheek, but I'm about to rip Hannah Montana's tongue out through a T. Je suis la fille en feu. Call me Candace Everdeen.
Hold on, what was that?
Tongue out through a T.
Je suis la fille en feu. I think je suis is I am. I can't properly translate that, unfortunately. So if that was fire, bear with me. I can't give it. I'm indifferent to that line. Her intensity is good. I like her intensity. Her turn the other cheek. It's not like she'd be considered a pacifist, right? not really. Like from what we can tell, she's not necessarily a pacifist, but I guess in this, I don't know if she would have lived life as a pacifist if not given her visions. I'd assume she would. Like, she probably wouldn't raise a sword unless she felt it was in the name of God or whatever. So yeah, okay. I am the fire lady. Thank you. Okay. And I never saw Hunger Games, but I'm sure that's fire. Oh, that line was fire. Like I said, that line was fire. Okay.
When it comes to bad bitches, I'm the patron saint. But I only get down on my knees when it's time to pray. I came to French Ben's aid in the time of need. Cause I'm the maid of Orleans, you're the Mardi Gras bees, honey. My father taught me things your daddy couldn't teach ya. Your highest calling was a text from Wiz Khalifa.
Oh.
Something Miley, just picture your epitaph. Had the world watching just to show them all her flat ass. Sweet bird.
Okay. God damn it, Miley. Oh God. Oh, I was just ready to say something and then I caught that right there. Oh no. Okay, I love rap battles or whatever. This one could really go either way at this point. Like, Miley had the hardest line, and then she's opening up with like kind of a callback to that line, clearly. I think Joan like hit her more, but like nothing she said was like super crazy. But Miley was unfocused, I suppose. That's one of the big problems with rap battles. You got to be focused. You got to talk to your opponent. Miley's talking about herself a little too much. She had the steak line, which I still think is the best one so far. But yeah, she didn't hit her as hard. They like I said, could go either way. They each at least have one more verse. So we'll see.
Had the world watching just to show them all her flat ass. Sweet bird. No pun intended. You're a cross-dressing peasant, but
pun intended.
Defended. But when I come under fire, I can hashtag handle it. If God's in your corner, girl, you need better management.
Oh, dude, that was fire. That was a great verse. I don't care what anyone says here. Miley's currently winning. Joan's got a deficit here. The burn line, like, that hurts. Just straight up dissing God as like, what would hurt Joan the most? That would definitely hurt her. She seems pissed.
If God's in your corner, girl, you need better management. Do not take the Lord's name in vain, you ratchet skank. Your manager's riding you to the achy breaky bank.
Oh, okay, that doesn't really hurt Miley. It's just referencing a song by her dad. But like her manager riding her to the bank. Okay, that's all right.
Your manager's riding you to the achy breaky bank. Be thankful for your talent, don't just rub it on your crotch. Keep your party in the USA. Viva la France.
Who war? Who's that?
Okay, this was like a middle of the road ERB, I'll say. It's middle of the road, like not like the craziest line. The craziest lines were from Miley, clearly. Her second verse was like, gosh darn fire. I keep saying fire, which, you know, is the reason why I think Miley might have taken this one. That was funny. That was funny. Oh god. And like the elements of like being betrayed by the people that she fought for. Like, that's grounded in history, yo. I like that. You see how like my speech gets so much more loose when I'm talking about rap. It's like a force of habit. Because that's when I talk about rap, like that's how a lot of the people I talk about rap music with, like the way they talk is a little bit looser, so I loosen up a little bit more. I think that's kind of funny. Yeah, Miley took that. That second verse was killer. She clearly had Joan's feelings hurt. I think at the time when that came out, a lot of people were probably like, yeah, Joan killed it, because they didn't want to like Miley Cyrus. I think we've all softened probably on Miley Cyrus. I think people were unfair to her during like, she's a child star. She went through a lot. She's maybe going through an identity crisis. Maybe it's all a publicity stunt. Who really cares? That's how I always feel about that sort of stuff. Yeah, but I think at the time it was probably, I bet a lot of people were like, yeah, Joan of Arc just like rip her tongue out through her teeth or whatever. Like, yeah, she took it with that one. Oh, that, like, it's hard to, like, in these things, I like it when they do a diss that would actually hurt the other person's feelings, like calling Miley a slut, essentially. That's not really gonna hurt her feelings, and she basically, like, deflected that with her, like, handle it thing, which was a fantastic line. And the getting burned at the stake thing, that was fire. But that second verse where she comes in and, like takes the Lord's name in vain, brings back the fire thing, and like it was just generally a really good verse. That verse must be from a better rap battle, because this one was middle of the road, but that verse was fire. I can't stop saying fire. It feels like I'm doing it on purpose, but that's just what I say when I refer to a hot verse in the realm of the hippity hoppities.